everybody, to BookEnds Online Edition, produced by Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Storyseller in collaboration with New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. BookEnds programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. This month's speaker is Ross Gay. Ross Gay is a nationally known poet and essayist whose roots include family in Wadena County. Ross Gay's mother grew up in Verndale, and as a boy, he vacationed every summer at his grandparents'. Recently, he spent a year writing an essay every day about something that delighted him. More than 100 of them, including ones that mentioned Verndale, ended up in the Book of Delights, which was released by Algonquin Books in 2019. His new poem, Beholding, was released in September 2020 from the University of Pittsburgh Press. Next month's bookend will be Saturday, October 9th. It will feature Jeff Herbach. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them through the chat. If you'd like to order books, you may do so through Gillette at our bookseller at travelandstoryseller@gmail.com. Now, let's welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, Ross Gay. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to see you. Good to be here with you. Shelley, thank you. We're probably cousins.
I'm related to a lot of people, so okay.
I know. It's so funny, like that region. So I'm just going to tell you, like when this book was about to come out, I came up to the booksellers. There's some regional booksellers thing in it was in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. Probably this was 2019.
Yeah, 2019, the Heartland Fall Forum. We met.
Okay. Okay.
I have a signed copy.
Told you we're related. And so it was such a pleasure, one, just to be at these book things, because I'm a little bit shy, and I'm not crazy about. I often don't know what to talk to people about, but like when you're talking about books and bookstores, it's kind of easy for some of me, but not for everyone. But I was like, but then when you all came up, and I was like, this is crazy. There are people who know Verndale, Minnesota, which there are, yes. It just felt like the luckiest, it felt like the luckiest thing in the world and kind of like a miracle. So anyway, the fact that you all asked me to come do this again, it's just delights me to no end. And it's also feels kind of just differently fun to be like, oh, these people are gonna know what I'm talking about. So, I think part of being an okay writer is to be able to make everyone know some about what you're talking about, but you all are going to be able to see it, which feels really, really lucky. Okay, this is called The High Five from Strangers, Etc. Today, I was wandering the square of the small Indiana town where I gave a poetry reading at the local college. A feature of the small town Midwest. A city hallish building in the center, always with some sad statue trumpeting one war or another. This one had a guy in one of those not very protective looking hats they called a helmet during World War I. He's carrying, naturally, a gun. Jenna Osman's book, Public Figures, alerted me to the ubiquity of the gun, the weapon, in the hands of our statues. A delight I wish to now imagine and even impose, given that beneficent dictatorship of one's own life anyway, is a delight. All new statues must have in their hands flowers, or shovels, or babies, or seedlings, or chinchillas. We could go on like this for a while. But never again, never ever guns. I decree it, and I also decree the removal of the already extant guns. Let the emptiness our war heroes carry be the metaphor for a while. As I was finishing circling the square, I passed a storefront garage with huge Make America Great Again signs. It was a foreign auto repair shop, and inside were mostly Toyotas and Hondas. I settled into the coffee shop, took my notebooks out, and I was reading over these delights, transcribing them into my computer. And while I was working, headphones on, swaying to the new De La Soul record, Delight, which deserves its own entry, I noticed a white girl She looked 15, but could have been maybe a college student, standing next to me with her hand raised. I looked up, confused, pulled my headphones back, and she said, like a coach or something, "Working on your paper? Good job to you. High five." And you better believe I high-fived that child in her itty-bitty Def Leppard shirt and her teeny tiny Doc Martens. For I delight in unequivocally pleasant public physical interactions with strangers. What constitutes pleasant, it's no secret, is informed by my large-ish male and cisgender body. A body that is also large-ish male, cisgender, and not white. In other words, the pleasant, the delightful are not universal. We should all understand this by now. A few months ago, walking down the street in Umbertide in Italy, a trash truck pulled up beside me and the guy in the passenger seat yelled something I didn't understand. I said, "Como?" The Spanish word for come again, which is a ridiculous thing to say because even if he had come again, I would not have understood him. He knew this, and hopping out of the truck to dump in a couple cans, he flexed his muscles, pointed at me and smacked my biceps hard, twice. I loved him. Or when a waitress puts her hand on my shoulder, forget if she calls me baby, honey, even better. Or someone scooting by puts their hand on my back. The handshake, the hug, I love them both. Once I was getting on a plane and shuffling down the aisle, I saw sitting at the front of the coach, reading a magazine, my great Uncle Earl. I got down on my knees and put my hand on his forearm and I said, "Uncle Earl, it's me, Ross." He looked at me kind of quizzically, as did the woman traveling with him, who did not look one bit like my Aunt Sylvia, which made me look back at my not Uncle Earl, who looked maybe like my Uncle Earl's second cousin 20 years ago. And though it was benign and no one was hurt, it was a little weird. And they looked confused. All the same, given his Uncle Earl died about 6 months later, I'm delighted I got to see him and touch him gently, lovingly, about 1,000 miles away. I want to find this one about, this one that's very explicitly about my grandfather. I can read this one in the meantime. This is called Babies, seriously. So let me just re-explain the sort of premise of the book. Most of you know this, but it's from August 1st, my birthday, August 1st of 2016 to August 1st of 2017. I wrote one essay, more or less one essay a day for the year about something that delighted me. So all of the titles are just kind of like journal entries almost, or the titles sort of work like a journal entry. And today I was on an airplane, this day I was on an airplane and a baby delighted me. Babies, seriously. Today, while I was reading on the airplane with my knees smashed into the seat in front of me, a toddler toddled down the aisle in her pink onesie with the panda head hood. She was a remarkably postured little creature, like so many of her ilk, and bold, toddling toward the back of the plane in front of her mother, who was doing a good job of letting the top explore. But as the baby got near my row, the man in front of me with his sleeping mask slid up on his forehead, widened his eyes, and smiled manically, making kissing noises at the baby. He spoke a language I didn't understand, but the sounds he was making to this baby, which, with his traveling companions, became a chorus of sounds, made me wonder if baby talk is a universal or universal-ish language, for I understood exactly what they were saying, and how nice of God to make this exception around the language adults speak to babies. Anyhow, the man was so enchanted with this petite creature with wings of hair feathering north and big eyes that he couldn't resist first poking the child's tummy before scooping the squirt onto his knee, where she stood bouncing and grinning, looking back to her mom, who looked a touch nervous, before being set free and retreating back down the aisle and returning again, upon which the choir of babbling would commence, everyone reaching toward the munchkin. Picture the halftime show at a basketball game when the mascot bazookas t-shirts into the crowd, scooping her up and again, and again, and again, And so I was so flabbergasted by the endurance of love and delight incited by this child to whom I presume none of these people was related. A love and delight that seemed analogous to the one that makes some people struggle not to eat the faces of babies, that I found myself, despite the very engrossing book I was reading about something horrible, laughing out loud and babbling with them and convinced again of something deeply good in us. Oh, here my grandma shows up in this one. Alice Seton. I suspect there will be, it's called bobblehead, like those little bobblehead dolls. I suspect there will be no more apparently superficial delight than this one, given as I am swirling in a volley of birdsong, given the pine tree just beyond me has a branch like an arm bent into a greeting, given the neighbor just started mowing his lawn, given the near glowing green of these trees against the soft blue of a misty morning. But it's true, I adore bobblehead toys, one of which passed by me on a dashboard, maniacally agreeing to everything. As a kid, I might also have loved the Weeble Wobble, or at least I loved the commercial, which is probably the closest I got to that toy, for which I commend my parents, given, as I recall, the purpose of that toy was to encourage a child to strike it as hard as possible to see if it would stay down. Bad toy idea. I Googled the Weeble Wobble to find out that I have conflated the Weeble Wobble with the Bozo and, I imagine, other people-faced punching bags. Bad toy idea still. The syrup-filled Godzilla my folks got me one Christmas when I was about 4 would not, for another child, have been a bad toy idea. But for me, it was simply a Godzilla-shaped blunt object with which to beat my big brother, whom I loved, but I didn't yet know how to express that love, thanks to all the Weeble Wobble commercials, probably. People-faced punching bag commercials, I mean. Thankfully, my grandmother noticed this ignorance on my part, snatching the Godzilla from my hand on my backswing as my brother cowered below and thunked me on the head with it, hard, once. It was a similar tutelage when I was tugging Spot's floppy spotted ear on the farm while she was feeding the chickens. Hearing Spot's yelps, she marched toward us and yanked my ear hard, once. I fell to the ground and rolled my eyes into my head, which I spent a lot of time practicing with my brother on car rides, making it so only the whites showed. My other grandmother, my Nana, who had more of a reputation for clocking people, sat next to my granny on the couch, singing high-pitched notes of approval. I could hear in my curly-headed labyrinth of revenge, my granny, Alice, whispering my name, in the diminutive, of course, Rossi, Rossi, and gradually getting louder, which I used as encouragement to crank my eyes even further, even longer. A good show my mom ruined by saying something like, oh, please, give me a break. The dumb plasticness of the toys, which are often in the likeness of famous athletes, makes me wonder if it's the toy itself that delights me, or if it's the fact that the toy alerts me regularly to the fact that people are delighted by such goofy, ridiculous things, which reminds me of a fairly common childlikeness, which encourages soft-heartedness, I think. Ah, here he is. This is Shorty, Shorty Seton. The wave of unfamiliars. Today I was waved at twice, and so delighted, by people I didn't know. It was a sort of placid, warm wave of unfamiliars that I learned from my grandpa, Shorty, riding the country roads outside of Burndale, Minnesota, population 559, where the driver of every passing truck or car, he raised his first two fingers to, where to the driver of every passing truck or car, he raised his first two fingers to the stiff brim of his John Deere ball cap and cut them through the air, like the gentlest initiation of a curveball ever. It was an elegant wave, understated, that intimated an older time of hat tipping and such, of hats and such, an older time of neighborliness, which is actually the present time too, evidenced by my two unfamiliar wavers. When I was a kid, I figured my grandpa knew everyone here in the Verndale region, which was not unthinkable to me, given as the apartment complex where my brother and I grew up probably housed about 3 or 4 times the number of people who lived in Verndale, where he lived his whole life. And though I didn't, I could imagine waving to most of the people in our apartments, given as I delivered the piggyback shopper to every one of them, not to mention all the knock-knock zoom. But my grandpa's waving got more impressive as he kept it up out on the country roads past Wadena and Staples and New York Mills and Alexandria. My grandpa was like an ambassador. He waved all the way down to St. Cloud and on our way over to Duluth. He waved down to the cities when we went to see Kirby Puckett and Kent Herbeck do their thing. But nothing confirmed my grandpa's fame more than when he waved us down to Brainerd to see Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox, the huge statues toward whom he touched the brim of his cap, bellowed, "Welcome Matthew and Ross Gay from Langhorne, Pennsylvania." My grandpa, Virgil Seaton, was the mayor of Minnesota. So nice to read this to people who know exactly what I'm talking about. Let me do a couple more of these. This is called Tomato on Board. Actually, let me do this one first. This is called Ode. This is from this book called Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. And there's a bunch of these odes in here. This is called Ode to Drinking Water from My Hands, which today in the garden, I'd forgotten I'd known, and more forgotten I'd learned and was taught this by my grandfather, who in the midst of arranging and watering the small bouquets on mostly the freshest graves, saw my thirst and cranked the rusty red pump, bringing forth from what sounded like the gravelly throat of an animal, a frigid torrent. And with his hands, he made a lagoon from which he drank and then I drank, before he cranked again, making of my hands now a fountain in which I can see the silty bottom drifting while I drink, and my grandfather waters the flowers on the graves, among which are his and his wife's, unfinished and patient, glistening after he rinses the bird shit from his wife's, and the pump exhales, and I drink to the bottom of my fountain, and I join him in his work. That's the Verndale Cemetery, which we spent a lot of time at. Because that's what, you know, people like took care of the graves, took care of everyone's graves. The other thing, and my grandpa got in a lot of trouble for this. he liked to let us drive the truck. he put us on his lap and we would drive the truck. Well, this was like a 67, I don't know, green, you know, Mr. Miller, you probably know the kind of truck it was. It was some kind of green, like a Chevy, like a 67 Chevy or something, which is to say it had a wheel like this and it did not have power steering. So if you were 10 years old trying to steer this thing, wasn't gonna work. And one time we were going out to the cemetery to take care of the graves, and I was on my grandpa's lap and steering the truck. And it didn't work. And we drove right into the pillar there, you know, whatever. And it got bashed up and the radiator broke and everything else. And my grandmother, who, you know, as I say in another essay that I'm working on now, my grandma was kind of she was a bad nana. She was tough, you know? And when he came home, she was like, we loved to say, "You dumbass." Anyway, that's, you got to know, this is a little bit more, filling it out for you. But That last essay took place at that cemetery where we also wrecked the truck. Maybe I'll have to write an essay about that too, or a poem. This one is not about that, but this is called Tomato on Board from the Delights. Well, you don't know until you carry a tomato seedling through the airport and onto a plane. Is it carrying a tomato seedling through the airport and onto a plane will make people smile at you almost like you're carrying a baby, a quiet baby. I did not know this until today, carrying my little tomato about 3 or 4 inches high in its 4-inch plastic starter pot, which my friend Michael gave to me, smirking about how I was going to get it home. Something about this at first felt naughty, not comparing a tomato to a baby, but carrying the tomato onto the plane. And so I slid the thing into my bag while going through security, which made them pull the bag for inspection. When the security guy saw it was a tomato, he smiled and said, "I don't know how to check that. Have a good day." But I quickly realized that one of its stems, which I almost wrote as arms, was broken from the jostling, and it only had 4 of them. So I decided I'd better just carry it out in the open. And the shower of love began. It was a shower of love I also felt while carrying a bouquet of lilies through the streets of Rome last summer. People, maybe women especially, maybe women my age-ish and older especially, smiling with approval. A woman in a house dress beating out a rug on a balcony shouted, "Bravo!" An older couple holding hands both smiled at me and pulled into each other, knitting their fingers together. My showerers might have been disappointed to know I was not giving the lilies to a sweetheart, but to a couple of my friends, Damiano and Moira, who had translated a few of my poems into Italian and were so kind as to let me stay at their place a couple nights while I was passing through. On the way to the vegetarian restaurant Damiano's ex-wife owns with her partner, we walked by what I'm pretty sure Damiano said is the biggest redbud tree in the world. It stretched for yards, lounging periodically onto the mossy earth. Its beautiful black bark glistened by the streetlights. Though translation is an act of love, so my showerers needn't be disappointed at all. Before boarding the final leg of my flight, one of the workers said, "Nice tomato," which I don't think was a come on. And the flight attendant asked about the tomato at least 5 times, not an exaggeration, every time calling it my tomato. "Where's my tomato? How's my tomato? Hey, you didn't lose my tomato, did you?" She even directed me to an open seat in the exit row. "Why don't you guys go sit there and stretch out?" I gathered my things and set the little guy in the window seat so she could look out. When I got my water, I poured a little into the little guy's soil. When we got bumpy, I put my hand on the little guy's container, careful not to snap another arm off. And when we landed and the pilot put the brakes on hard, my arm reflexively went across the seat, holding the little guy in place, the way my dad's arm would when he had to brake hard in that car without seatbelts to speak of, in one of my very favorite gestures in the Encyclopedia of Human Gestures. And let me read one more, and then maybe we'll just talk a little bit. Actually, we're gonna read 2, because here's one on my mom. This is called Judith Irene Gay, aged 76 today. As I wrote on July 13th. On this, my mother's 76th birthday, I am picturing her telling the story about how, pretty numbed up after having a cap on a molar replaced, she went to her neighborhood supermarket, where she is a regular, for some chicken noodle soup. When she got back into her car and was looking into her mirror to back out of her parking space, she saw snot was running down her face, into her mouth, which she couldn't feel thanks to the lidocaine. My mother is among the most self-berating people I know, and has been known to wake up from dreams chastising herself for what innocuous things she did there. This snot mouth situation is ripe for such self-beration, which might in the past have included a self-imposed exile from her supermarket and recurrent crippling bouts of disgust and shame. But these days, my mother tells this story of buying chicken noodle soup with a river of snot running into her mouth and laughs so hard that she has to hold her head up. She laughs and holds the kitchen table lest she fall from her chair telling that story. She gasps and cries a little bit. She is accepting, it seems, what she is, one of the varieties of life. And I'm just gonna read you one more. This is the best story. I mean, that story, because my mom is so like, she could be crippled with shame. And the story was like, she went to the dentist and she just couldn't feel her face. So she like, it was just like, and for some people that'd be like funny and a joke, you know, it'd be like, oh, that's my mother. But she really laughed. Actually, she told it like 3 or 4 times. I made her tell it like 3 or 4 times and then it became very funny to her. For which she can thank me later. All right, this is called Burial. And this is a poem. This is a poem for my father. But so that means it's for my mother too. And it's also a poem in which I usually start, I usually ask the audience when I read it in live, I ask the audience if anyone's ever done anything with a placenta, because you know there's a tradition of planting a placenta with a tree. And the last time I read this poem, it was funny. As I was reading, our neighbors next door were dropping off a box of apples that come from a tree that was planted with a placenta. You know, and it's a red. Weirdly, it's a red delicious apple tree. To me, red delicious apples are some of the worst tasting apples there are. They destroy the apple with the red delicious. These red delicious are incredible. They're incredible. So, you know, who knew? You're right. You're right. It's called Burial. You're right. You're right. The fertilizer is good. It wasn't a gang of dullards came up with chucking a fish in the planting hole or some midwife got lucky with the placenta. Oh, I'll plant a tree here. And a sudden flush of quince and jam enough for months. Yes, the magic dust our bodies become casts spells on the roots, about which someone else can tell you the chemical processes, but it's just magic to me. Which is why a couple springs ago, when first putting in my 2 bare root plum trees out back, I took the jar which has become my father's house, and lonely for him and hoping to coax him back, for my mother as much as me, I poured some of them into the planting holes, and he dove in, glad for the robust air, saddling a slight gust into my nose and my mouth, chuckling as I coughed, but mostly he disappeared into the minor yawns in the earth, into which I placed the trees, casting the gray dust of my old man evenly throughout the hole, replacing then the clods of dense Indiana soil until the roots and my father were buried, watering it all in with one hand while holding the tree with the other, straight as the flag to the nation of simple joy, of which my father is now a naturalized citizen, waving the flag from his subterranean lair, the roots curled around him like shawls or jungle gyms, like hookahs or the arms of ancestors, before breaststroking into the xylem, riding the elevator up through the cambium and into the leaves where, when you put your ear close enough, you can hear him whisper, "Good morning." Where, if you close your eyes and push your face, you can feel his stubbly jowls. And good Lord, this year he was giddy at the first real fruit set and nestled into the 30 or 40 plums in the 2 trees, peering out from the sweet meat with his hands pressed against the purple skin like cathedral glass. And imagine his joy as the sun wizarded forth those abundant sugars and I plodded barefoot and prayerful at the first ripe plums swell and blush, almost weepy, conjuring some surely ponderous verse to convey this bottomless grace, you know, oh Father, kind of stuff. Hundreds of hot air balloons filling the sky in my chest, replacing his intubated body, listing like a boat keel side up, replacing the steady stream of water from the one eye, which his brother wiped before removing the tube, keeping his hand on the forehead until the last wind in his body wandered off, while my brother wailed like an animal. And my mother said, weeping, "It's okay. It's okay. You can go, honey." At all of which my father guffawed by kicking from the first bite buckets of juice down my chin, staining one of my 2 button-down shirts, the salmon-colored silk one, hollering now, "There's more of that," almost dancing now in the tree, in the plum. the way he did as a person, bent over and biting his lip and chucking the one hip out and then the other, with his elbows cocked and fists loosely made and eyes closed and mouth made trumpet, when he knew he could make you happy just by being a little silly and sweet. Thank you.
Come on, Shelley.
Ross, I'm reading your book, Beholding,
Oh, cool, yeah.
and it's very different to me with the really short lines. How did you think it that? Do you think it that way, or do you write it and then break it up into short lines, or what do you do?
Yeah. I mean, every poem has its own kind of logic that I discover along the way, but like that Beholding poem it's interesting to me for a number of reasons. One is that I wrote it over the course of about 4 or 5, well, like officially kind of started knowing I'm working on a poem, whatever kind of the date that I say is the date, like whatever, April something, 2015. And then I wrote it until, whenever I finished it 4 years later. But I also, part of that poem actually originated in this kind of weird novel that I was working on that didn't work out. But part of that was actually prose that became kind of changed up into lines. It's had so many different forms. So the lines themselves, something like a part of it was prose. Some of it, might be longer lines. At some point, I had it in long couplets. At some point, I had it as one single stanza, no breaks between it. But then I started getting where I wanted the form of the thing to allude to ideas, other ideas. So for one thing, I wanted that, because for those of you who haven't read the poem, it's center justified, which is among a certain kind of way that's a little bit naughty. It's a little bit beginnerish.
No, I don't know what it's called either. But it's very effective.
I teach at an MFA program, at a graduate program, and like if you were to bring in a center justified poem to a workshop, they would tell you, or they would, even if they wouldn't say it, they would think, oh, you're really a beginner. So as am I. I'm really a beginner at this point, So it's center justified. But it's part of the why I wanted to be center justified in couplets is because so much of the poem is about flight or ascension or getting away, and so I wanted to look like a ladder. That's one of the things that I wanted.
Oh, okay.
And then part of the other thing with those couplets, they give me an opportunity to make like each of those couplets, they don't all work like this, but some of those couplets work as like discrete poems, like really intensely wrought little discrete poems that if you took them out, they kind of opened the poem up further. So that's I'd say that's a few things to think about. Yeah.
Have you used that technique on other poems, or is this unique? I haven't read all of your work yet.
When you say the technique, which technique?
Yeah.
Which technique?
Oh, the little short couplets like that you.
Not as much. I like couplets, and I have some poems in my book catalog where there is something about the couplet form, and I think it has, I can't quite yet parse this out, but it's something to do with narrative. Like when I'm telling stories, there's something that I like about couplets, and I don't know why. I could kind of like fake it. I could kind of say that couplets imply two, it implies a person telling a story to another person, so the two lines make sense. But I don't know if that's right, but I like couplets. But I feel like because this was a book-length poem, I had a more opportunity to think harder about how those couplets make little discrete.
Amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
It's very effective.
Yeah,
I like it. I love it. And I love your Book of Delights too. That one I've read cover to cover a couple of times.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Which way do you like to tell stories better, through the essays or through the poetry?
Great question. Great question. Yeah. I don't know. I like stories, you know, period. I know that, but it's funny. Yeah, it's a great question. It stumped me. But one of the things that I'll say, and maybe correct myself as I'm saying it, like what I love about poems is that there's already kind of baked into the form or the idea of the poem that you can jump around, you know, like a poem already has in our way that we think of poems, that they can mean a bunch of things at once, you know, or like, you know, it can be, we just know that. And so often when we think of like essays, we think of essays as having, you know, the way that essays are taught in school for sure. But even I think as we think of an essay, we think of like a kind of coherent meaning to a thing. Or there's going to be you know, it's going to kind of tell a story. It's going to have a thesis. It's going to tell a story. It's going to have a kind of conclusion and a resolution. Part of what I like about writing essays is that I'm always arguing with that premise. I'm always arguing with the premise that an essay ought to mean one thing or ought to mean in a kind of coherent way. So it's really fun to me to try to make essays. And I'm just kind of articulating this as through your question. It's really fun to me and I'm also sitting with my buddy Bernardo, who's working on, I'm writing another book of delights. And so Bernardo's helping me transcribe them. And so I'm hearing them in a different way because I'll read them to him and then we kind of go back and forth, talk about them a little bit. But I'm hearing them and realizing that I'm always trying to find in the essay ways that poems work, I think. I'm always trying to make a poem do the same thing that I love about, you know, tell a story in an essay in the same way that I love about what a poem makes possible. So I'm trying to like jump around in time, for instance. I'm trying to like have digressions automatically be part of the essay, you know. Like I'm very not interested actually in the straight story. I'm not interested in telling it. I'm mostly not interested in hearing it, you know, probably unless I'm like, I need something. Right, or you took something from me. I want the straight story. But for the most part, I'm interested in digression as a form. And so I'm interested in poems, how they can automatically do that and accommodate that. But I'm also interested in like forcing digression into essay forms or prose, you know? Yeah.
Which kind of answers my other kind of question or comment, which is about, you know, stories and the short story, which can also be a vignette. And does it really need to have a beginning and a middle and an end? If you write the vignette to ask a question, does the question have to be answered? If you write a poem with a question in mind, does the question have to be answered in the poem or in the vignette?
Exactly. I mean, to me, like life is about questions being unanswered, largely unanswered. That's what called life to me, you know. and you know, and the answering of questions often is the imposition of a kind of brutality upon something that might actually be open and might actually require that we ask other people to help us with a thing, you know. So partly what I'm really interested in is I take your point perfectly. I mean, I'm with you on that. Like, so often the openness of things or the unresolvedness of things, I mean, things change, things happen, but often the idea of the conclusion, and this is what this means, is actually a kind of imposition of, you know, sometimes it's just kind of like simplistic, sometimes it's brutal. And I want to sort of be aware of that in my writing and in my thinking and in my living, you know.
It's kind of like an imposition of an artificial order on a world that is naturally chaotic.
Yeah.
And life never actually has an epilogue that neatly ties everything up in a bow and resolves everything.
That's it. Yeah. It's like life itself is a profound and luminous entanglement that at any moment it's like the zillion things. It's the zillion things. And so the moment you sort of had a kind of clarity of assertion, it's like, and then it's like, okay, well, there's the trillion things, so I better go check in on the trillion things, see what they think, you know.
There's just that one moment of clarity.
Yeah, which is precious.
More questions and confusion.
Yeah. I think that's a precious thing, and actually, like the way you say it, it helps me think about it. I teach beginning writers, and right this semester, I'm teaching an introduction to creative writing class. And I was trying to say something in a conversation with another poet the other day, and I didn't quite get to the thing that you're saying so clearly, which is that sometimes the desire to put a conclusion on something actually impedes with this other magical thing, which is a moment of clarity, a moment of understanding or meaning. It does not have to be closed. It could just be a moment of understanding or meaning or clarity. That often, in the way I experience it, often gets diminished when we start to be like, and that is the meaning of life. You know? It's like, no, that's what just happened. You know, that just happened. You know. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Where are you teaching?
I teach at Indiana University.
Okay.
I teach at Indiana. I ask questions at Indiana University.
Well, that was how Socrates taught, by asking questions.
That's good company.
And I think you get people to learn more rather than just giving them the answers.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
What led you to, did you always know you wanted to be a poet, a writer, or was there something that led you on this path?
Yeah, no, not at all. I wanted to be a football player, you know. I wanted to be a football player. And I wasn't reading books. My brother kind of read books, and my dad read books all the time. So I come from people who read books. My mother was a teacher. My mother was an English teacher for a while. As were all these lots of other like Seton and Seton adjacent people, and people on my dad's side of the family too. I come from a lot of educators. But I just wasn't into it. I was into football, basketball, and skateboarding, you know, and I was, kind of a way that the story I mainly tell is that I was about to fail out of college, and I had a teacher who had me give a presentation on a poet named Amiri Baraka. He saw that I was just like out, you know, I was just out to sea or out to lunch. And he asked me to give a presentation on this poet, and that poet, Amiri Baraka, his poems changed my life. And I started to think, oh, that's a neat thing to do. So I started reading and, you know, trying to write poems and other stuff too. I just got real serious in a certain kind of way. I also, at that time, I met other people who were like way into making stuff and doing this kind of thinking, other kinds of thinking work. The other thing though I want to say is that I come from people who have all of these modes of expression or thinking or being, that the older I get, the more I realize like, oh, that was a kind of teaching of how to be a poet. You know, for instance, like I said about my mother a little bit, like when she gets to laughing, she really laughs. And one of the things that makes her laugh, and she can do it, and she was a great admirer of it, is hyperbole, which is the poetic device of like making something way bigger, you know, just making it, or literary device, whatever you call it. And it's one of the modes that me and my brother, like when we say about my mom, like whatever, like we were being bad, and my mom, like, you know, hits us with the wooden spoon to get us out of the goddamn kitchen because she's making oatmeal raisin cookies from the Methodist, you know, cookbook, you know, from the Verndale United Methodist cookbook. Like, she's like, you know, it gets more and more and more and more. And like, eventually, you know, there's like all kinds of batter in it. And she hits us both with the thing. And then we have like batter in our hair. And then we have raisins in our hair. And then we're like picking it out for the next. And my mother, she loses her shit about this. She thinks it's hyperbole makes her lose her mind, you know? And so in a way, like, I know that, and she's also she was a drama teacher for a while, and she's kind of dramatic. She's kind of like, you know, like if she was reading poems, she'd probably be a pretty good reader of poems, you know? So that's a thing. I think of my father, who, you know, was many things, but among the many things, he had a sense of metaphor. And I tell this story every once in a while, but when my dad, when we were little, you know, there was a button on the, we had a Toyota Corolla, 78 Toyota Corolla. And on that one, it still looks like on a lot of cars, the windshield wiper button, it had a little picture, which to us, we know that means, if we can see, we know that means like the fluid on the windshield. But if you're a little kid and your dad told you it was a flower, you might think, oh yeah, that's the flower. Which is what our dad did. He said, if you push this button, motherfuckers, if you push this button, again, because that's a flower. The car is going to turn into a flower, and a big bee is going to come and sting us all. Look, I was about 12 years old, and my brother the same. Like, you talk to my brother, you talk to Matt, and we were old before we were like, oh, that's not actually a flower button. That's a windshield wiper fluid. Which to me, that's an example of like storytelling one, but metaphor. Like, he gave us the opportunity to be like, you can push a button and turn a car into a flower. This is wild. This is wild, you know? Which also means like, you can push a button and like, you know, make something terrible good, you know? That also is part of that story.
Cool. So I guess it was just something that was there, and later on was when you.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, in the air. You know, I could talk about how my grandparents, you know, I can talk about things that my grandparents, you know, my grandfather, Shorty, like, he used to say, like, when we were being bad, he would never spank us. That wasn't what they were doing. But if we were being bad, he would like sing a song, I guess some kind of, and we're gonna take you by the hand, by the hand, by the hand, we're gonna take you by the hand. The song, you know, it's just automatic. It was part of the thing, you know. Or my grandmother, you know, like these little lessons about like how do you treat the dog, you know, how do you treat Spot, or the fact that she could make up, like, she made the best donuts in you know, the continental US. My grandmother made the best donuts in the continental US, and like, that's a making. She was a maker, you know. That's a kind of imaginative thing. Not to mention their gardens. I mean, this is an important thing. Like, by the time they moved into town, so they lived out on that farm and then they moved into town, the first thing every single time, we weren't like gardeners, we didn't know anything, we were little kids. The very first thing we would always do upon coming into town, this is while my grandmother was alive and after my grandmother was dead, and we would visit my grandfather, we would drive around and look at everyone's gardens. We'd go by Avis's to see her irises, or, you know, whatever. And we'd go by, you know, Uncle Bob and Aunt Seal to see their thing. And then we'd go by and go see the corn, you know, out, you know, it's whoever's. And that is, to me, that's training for being a writer, you know, because you're going to go look at things that are beautiful. You're sharing what you love, you know. So I can go on and on and on. You can kind of tell. Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions besides? Okay, Gillette.
So it's not so much a question. I was really lucky last year. I discovered pawpaws. Two of my podcasts, two different ones, talked about pawpaws and how they're this fruit native to the United States. And both podcasts actually went back to you, Ross, and you. And it was, I had just met you at Heartland Fall Forum. It was like less than a year. And it was absolutely amazing. And I don't think we have pawpaws this far north, but now I'm intensely curious from your description and the podcast and everything. And it was definitely a delight that is now a longing in my life. So I just wanted to share that.
And yeah, if you could like zip down real quick, they're coming. And probably later today, I'm gonna walk by my buddy Alex's house and get about a 10, because he has way more than he could ever eat. That's so great. I love that. I love that. They're amazing. It's an amazing fruit. God.
Road trip.
Yes, road trip. Yeah. September, Bloomington. I will take you.
I will show up, and can I late enroll in your beginning writing class?
Oh yeah. You want to take the advanced one. You want to take it's more fun.
Okay.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions for our author? So we're hoping once the pandemic is over to get all the authors to come up to Wadena. Mm-hmm. To have sort of a book signing, meet the public party. So hopefully you'd come up to visit, because I'm sure there are a lot of people.
Yeah, keep in touch. And also, like, if you all are like itchy for someone to fill in, like you need another person to read or something, like because someone, for instance, maybe they are in the wrong time zone and they forget. You know, shoot me a note. It's just fun to, you know, because it's just fun to be with you all. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We're so delighted to meet you.